This time on Poll Hub, the new pope has gotten a lot of media attention, including some harsh treatment from some pretty prominent MAGA commentators here in the US. Surprised? Well, you shouldn't be. Religion and politics have pretty much mixed since the invention of both. But what do churchgoers think of all of this? We'll talk about that. Then, by this point, you've probably heard enough about the loneliness crisis to be ready to donate some of your own friends to the cause. But don't! We have some really interesting data that looks behind the headlines and sees this in a slightly different way. And we finish with a truly bizarre fun fact from the dawn of civilization. Lee, cue the caveman jokes. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Mary Griffith.
And I'm Lee Merrington.
So when white smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel and Pope Leo XIV emerged on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica a few weeks ago, more than a few conservative commentators rued the cardinal's choice. The new pope is unlikely to move the church away from the path that Pope Francis has steered the church over his reign. And that had plenty of MAGA figures up in arms. Trump favorite Laura Loomer raged for much of the day that this happened, calling him the, quote, woke Marxist pope, unquote. That was on all caps, naturally. Far-right conspiracy theorist Mark Cernovich wrote, quote, sorry, Catholics, this new pope is an open borders globalist. But in truth, politics and religion have always mixed. Remember the Crusades, right, from history class, you can go way back, or theocracies like Iran. MLK was a minister, right? And so much of the civil rights movement had to do with what was happening in churches. And of course, we remember the silent majority and the Christian right in the 80s and 90s. Televangelist Pat Robertson ran for president, after all, as did Al Sharpton. But what we were wondering is, what do parishioners think of all of this? So let's start with Pope Leo XIV. Then we're going to talk about the idea of politics being preached from the pulpit and what people think out in the pews about that. So an Economist YouGov poll taken just after the Pope's ascendancy showed 47% of Americans had a favorable view of him. 12% were unfavorable. 41% said they didn't yet know. That's fair. He's brand new. Asked if they thought it was appropriate that a pope try to influence U.S. domestic policy. 41% said it was inappropriate, compared to 29% who said it was appropriate. So let's stop there before we go on to the next set of questions. Does that surprise anybody in any way that 41%, the plurality of Americans, are like, yeah, it's inappropriate for the Pope to try and influence American policy?
Well, Lee isn't with us for this particular segment, so maybe I can play Lee for a moment and hearken back to when the U.S. elected its first Catholic president in John F. Kennedy. And certainly this is not as you point out, this is not a new issue. I mean, one of the major concerns and issues that he had to address and assuage during his campaign and even early in his presidency was that because he was Catholic, he was not going to be beholden to the Pope, but rather to the U.S. Constitution. So I don't think this is certainly it's not a new argument. I think the particular concern from the MAGA segment of our politics is that the Pope's constituency is also a very important constituency for Donald Trump and for Republicans. And I'm, thinking particularly of conservative Latino voters who generally tend to be Catholic. I'm also thinking of Catholics within the U.S., particularly white Catholics, who generally, since, Ronald Reagan, have been more conservative, particularly on social issues and abortion. So I don't think it's necessarily about Pope Leo the 14th influencing U.S. politics. I don't think that's necessarily in his game plan. I mean, the Pope is really a global leader, but it is very much a concern for politics here in the U.S. because of the constituency that not necessarily will be moved, but certainly may feel some cognitive dissonance between their political positions and the religious teachings.
So, Mary, the Pope, all popes have waded into politics, global politics and stuff, so that also isn't new. But let me read you a different kind of take on this from PRRI, who has done some great research. And this isn't specific to the Pope, but I'm just interested in your take on this. Because the Pope, of course, has a slightly higher figure than your average Baptist minister in some town, right? So PRI looked in 2022 at what the impact on parishioners was of when politics was spoken from the pulpit. They asked how often clergy at churches talked about issues, this is in 2022, like Donald Trump, abortion, poverty, inequality. And the results surprised me. 92% said that Trump never had come up or rarely came up. 56% said abortion had rarely or never come up. But 66% said poverty, inequality came up sometimes or often. To me, that kind of flipped the script on what I kind of perceived to be the preacher from the pulpit pitching for Donald Trump and MAGA and abortion and all that kind of stuff. Are you surprised by those numbers?
I have to say I'm not really surprised by the numbers because I think it's about the way that the issue is represented and presented from the pulpit. I mean, the president's name, regardless of who the president is, may not come out, but it really comes back to an ideological focus and which issues play into that ideological focus. So whereas President Trump's name never or rarely came up for most respondents, the issue of abortion, look at the issue there, that issue may have come up a little bit more than that. So I think really it's the context. And it's perhaps in some religious teachings, it's the way in which those issues reflect the canon law, if you will. I mean, it's the way you look at Catholicism. It comes back to the idea of what the church's teachings are. So there's a fine line, I do think, about the way that that issues are presented, and also the way that it's perceived by who's sitting in the pews. A lot of, I think, the perception is in which pew do you sit? Are you agreeing with what's being said, or do you disagree with what's being said? So I think that plays into it as well.
And Barb, there's another set of data that gets right at the heart of that, which is, well, what do you want? When you're sitting in the pews, do you want to hear about politics? Is that what people want to hear? And so from this same poll, they asked churchgoers, religious people, do you wish that politics were mentioned more during your services? 49% of evangelicals said they completely disagreed with that. 43% of Catholics and 47% of Mormons, same thing. It was largely no. The yeses were quite small. There was a lot of in between kind of, it's okay. Does that surprise you? That 49% of evangelicals say completely disagree. I don't want to hear more politics from the pew.
Well, I think particularly during religious services, people are there for religious services. And I don't think they want to be preached at. They want to be preached to. And so I think they're there to have a very different experience than what they might be reading about or hearing about when they're following current events. That said, I think that very often, particularly when you look at specific parishes, we often try to think of religious groups, evangelicals, Catholic, Mormons, Jewish American, and kind of paint them with a very broad brush. But even at parish level, you can have very diverse opinions across those parishes. I think people generally tend to find their people. And so you tend, if you have a particular perspective, worldview, political view, although people may be a little hesitant to call it a political view in that context, I think you find the place where you are comfortable, if you can. And religions as institutions, have a lot more than just their services. They are also ways for people to congregate in other ways. And so I think it's in those settings that I think politics may come into it a little bit more rather than just from the pulpit.
Do you think this was just like overplayed, like in the 80s? I just remember in the 80s, the silent majority, the televangelists, and the move of the Republican Party towards embracing some parts of the Republican Party, kind of embracing conservative religious figures. Was that kind of an outlier, do you think, in that we've kind of reverted to a norm where people are a little less interested in hearing the politics from the pulpit, no matter how they're going to vote, no matter what they think?
I'm not sure. You might disagree. Mary, but I don't think we've moved away from that notion that churches and synagogues and places of worship are still institutions where people congregate and where politicians can still engender support. So in that sense, I would say no. I don't think we have the intensity in the Catholic Church over abortion, particularly since the Supreme Court ruling and the dismantling of Roe v. Wade, because in a sense, it's somewhat become, a moot point. I mean, obviously, there's still a significant debate on a number of different issues, but it doesn't resonate like it did in the 80s and 90s. But clearly, when you see the discussion about the new pope, I think there is a very significant concern because he is speaking, whether he's intending to influence American politics or not, he is speaking to Americans about these issues and about what the church feels and what their doctrine will be on these issues. And many of them will and do conflict with what the Republican policy is.
Hey, Mary, your kids are in Catholic school, you go to church. Has this discussion come up since Leo has become Pope, Leo the 14th? Has this come up, or is this something that will take time, do you think, within parishes to kind of become topic of conversation, if ever?
I mean, by no means am I an expert, and let's lay it out there. Let's take a look at the reality that Pope Leo it's only been a couple of weeks since he assumed the role of Pope. I think that there's been a lot of attention on the successor to Pope Francis, whoever that person would have been, because of the stances that Pope Francis took. He took a much more liberal view than I think a lot of people and a lot of Catholics would have liked. And so with that, I think that there's a lot of attention to see what happens with Pope Leo and where he stands on many of the social issues. Of course, there is going to be discussion as he becomes more vocal moving forward and addressing some of the things that do come up, not just within the church, but how that relates to overall society, both not just, on the U.S. front domestically. And let's remember, this is the first U.S. Pope, so this is a pretty big deal, but also internationally and globally, because again, we're looking at the Pope in two aspects, both as head of state and as well as the head of a religion with many followers. So I think we had our guest, Jay, speak to the fact that when we talk about Catholics, we always tend to focus on one Catholic. When it really, the Pope is the focus when we talk about Catholics. But let's remember that there are many. And so whoever the leader is, regardless of whether we're looking at domestic policy here in the United States or globally, the religion, the policy, the doctrine all comes into play, and it will be a topic of conversation moving forward.
And on that point, Mary, we really don't have any sense right now as to what his priorities are going to be around the world and to what he is going to want to emphasize and to carve out really his own papacy.
What about your friends? Some of us from a certain generation, Jay gets the reference, recall that title from a TLC song from the early 1990s. But today, we're going to take a look at the number of friends that Americans have and whether or not that number actually matters. Is it quality versus quantity? And how does that play over into the overall discussion of loneliness? One that we've had on this podcast before, not in relation to how we feel when we get together, but perhaps just in general and how that affects American society. So let's take a look at some numbers from a 2023 Pew poll, where 61% of Americans said that having a close friend or having close friends was extremely or very important to having a fulfilling life. And another Pew survey, however, dug deeper to see what friendship looked like here in the United States. I think this is really interesting that 38% said that they had 5 or more close friends. 13 said they had 4 close friends. 18%, 3, 14%, 2, and 7% of Americans said that they only had 1 close friend. And this actually surprised me a little bit. 8% said that they had no close friends. So I'm really wondering here if that comes down to how Americans define what friendship is. And so here's something else from that poll. 66% from that poll said that all of their close friends, regardless of the number, are the same gender as they are. That I found somewhat striking. So let's pause here. And Jay, what do you think about the statistics?
I was shy. I mean, we've heard about this loneliness epidemic, and almost 4 in 10 Americans say they have 5 or more close friends. To me, that kind of just, not that that means there aren't people who are lonely and that there isn't an issue, especially as some of the statistics show with younger men. But for the stories we've done, especially starting in COVID, we have covered this topic a lot, and this really stood out to me that are we perhaps focusing, when we talk about loneliness and the fewer friends people have and the fewer close friends, are we focusing on a relatively small number of people who are in that situation and ignoring the fact that actually an awful lot of people have an awful lot of friends and are doing pretty well on that count?
I thought it was particularly interesting because this is also a 2023 Pew poll. I don't know, there is a sense that COVID friendship took a hit, with COVID because we could not connect in ways that certainly we were used to. So I was struck by the size of that number, that close to 40%. I also thought it was really interesting because this poll also looked at what do you talk about, with your friends. And I found it very interesting that it varies depending upon how old you are. And it differs in terms of men and women. Women are much more likely to talk about work and family and surprise. Guys are more likely to talk about sports and current events. But I think one thing that is really interesting is I think that people are making connections and recognize that although we tend to be drawn to the plurality, and certainly if we look at people who actually say they have two or more close friends, I mean, we're talking about 85% of Americans. But if we calculate out that other 15%, that still does speak to an issue where people do feel disconnected, or at least in terms of how we're measuring it, they are disconnected. And we have some other numbers that
I know, Mary, you want
speak
to
to
get
whether that's defined as loneliness.
I know you have some other numbers. I just wanted to jump one point right here. I would like to know from the three of you, who are my only close friends, whether you have developed a close friend in the last 5 years. I have a theory.
Yes.
And there goes
Yes.
no. Okay, so my theory is, I think,
And I've actually lost one too.
Oh, well. Okay.
Well, that's another question I have. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, okay. Well, I you don't mean to go off on a tangent here, but I'm thinking that to have a close friend, you have to share a lot and stuff, and there's a lot of history, and it's hard to make a close friend. And I'm thinking, as you get older, I'm thinking maybe it's a little harder to get close friends. I was hoping that this was going to be more age-driven. Mary, do your kids make close friends easily?
Yeah, I think they do.
I think so too.
I hope they do.
Well,
Okay.
actually, we do have some polling that speaks to that, Lee. And you are
Okay.
absolutely right that age does matter. People who have the toughest times making friends are actually youngest adults, the age group between 20 and 24, where a quarter of them either say they do not have a close friend or they only have one close friend. And I think you'll find this particular statistic really interesting. People between 66 years old and 70 years old, 18% of them say the same thing. It's actually kind of those two times in your life where you seem to have the most difficult times making friends. And if we think about it, those are really significant transitional points in adulthood.
But I also think, Barb, to your point, that circumstance sort of helps or hurts whether or not you can make new friends or even close friends. I mean, you think about, from my situation, I've made some pretty close friends through my children and their parents, and we've become close. So there's the exposure in that regard. So I do think that has a lot to do with it. But I am curious to get the group's take on this whole idea of loneliness, because when I think about being lonely, I don't necessarily associate it with friendship per se. When you think about loneliness, where I am never alone, even I wanted to be.
You'd like to be alone sometimes.
I have family. I have my immediate family. I have my extended family. I have friends. I have coworkers. So the idea of loneliness and being associated only with the idea of friendship is one that I found very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a distinction between you can be lonely and have a lot of friends. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I do think that this is jumbling together. I think one of the things that surprised me about this was that when we think about loneliness, we do tend to immediately jump to, well, if you have a lot of friends, you can't be lonely. And I think your point is well taken. The idea, though, that, nearly 4 in 10 Americans say they have 5 or more friends, I think that does raise a kind of a different question is, well, how do you get lonely? How do you feel loneliness if you have this many close friends? And that kind of comes back to, what are your friends for? What do you rely on them for? What are friends for? Right? I mean, that's a song too, I think, right? Yeah. And that's interesting because whether you're going to like lean on your friends, and there is some research on this. Pew last year looked into this, and they were looking into it in the question of male loneliness, but they asked a broader question, which is, well, what do you look for friends for? It turns out that men don't necessarily say they feel lonelier than women. It was about the same number, but the genders were wildly different when it comes to seeking out emotional support. So 74% of men and women said they would seek out support from their spouse or partner, but only 54% of women said that about a friend, or 54% of women said that about a friend. Only 38% of men say that. So there's this big gap about emotional support, which I think that may get to the core of what you're talking about, Mary, which is loneliness.
Another study that we did look at was also same year, 2023. And YouGov really dug into friendship and looked at how education influenced the number of friends that one had. And I found this study particularly interesting because it was one of their daily question surveys, which means it's an issue that they take on a daily basis and they kind of dive into. And they actually connected with nearly 40,000 Americans. And one of the things that they did find from this study was that for the majority of Americans, political party or gender didn't matter at all. But what did matter was education and income level in terms of people's ability to make friends and also, I think, their wider reach. Thoughts?
So I don't think it's surprising necessarily based on other research that we have about whether political beliefs affect or impact your friendships. I mean, and I had to laugh, Barb, when you were bringing up this data because I have a very, very dear friend who I've known since high school, and the two of us couldn't have more different views on many different topics and in many different areas. And also to the statistic about close friends being of the same gender, this is a guy who I've known since high school, and I consider him one of my absolute closest friends. So in that regard, I don't think that I was surprised, but I was a little bit surprised in terms of, but I wasn't surprised in terms of the level of education mattering. So I really, from my vantage point, I wasn't necessarily too surprised by the statistics, but there are some numbers that did surprise me. And whether or not your major influenced the size of your circle of friends. Believe it or not, accounting majors topped the list, with 64% saying it was somewhat or very easy to make friends. Biology majors, 58% of biology and business majors said it was easy for them to make friends. 55% of marketing, computer science, and math majors agreed. And this is to keep in mind that the number for all American adults is 53%. So was I alone in being surprised?
No, but what's the bottom? Read who the people are who have the toughest time.
The toughest time, 47% of liberal arts and social science majors said that it was easy to make friends. Yeah.
So Lee, does that explain why you have a limited friend group? You didn't major in accounting?
That's right. That's got to be it. But I think that, for liberal arts, this makes all the sense in the world, because for liberal arts and social science majors, the world is their laboratory of friendship, and they have to, they don't have trouble.
Well, that's real. That's real.
You think that was a little bit, but accounting and bio, they deal with a smaller number.
They're in the lab all day. They're over their spreadsheets, and so when they come out from that, they go, "I want friends." Yeah, I don't really buy that.
Is this like a Big Bang Theory kind of thing, Lee? Where they're all friends, so that like circle of friends is like 4 or 5 or whatever it was.
I truly don't know. But I tell you what I do know. I am looking so forward to this fun fact today, and that is the topic that's so near and dear to my heart. And it's the Neanderthals among us is the topic. And this is going to really, if you think we've been into the world of controversy, we've only just scratched the surface. So CBS in 60 Minutes of Vanity Fair in 2011 asked a poll, and let me put, first of all, what a recent study has told us, and I'm not sure you're all going to like this, that humans and Neanderthals inbred 10,000 years ago. and many modern humans carry Neanderthal genes in their DNA. All right, so pause. So now the Neanderthal sample by CBS wanted to know whether you buy this. So 38%, the plurality, says, I don't believe it. We're not from cavemen. The next group, 32%.
Those would be caveman deniers.
Caveman deniers. There you go. Well, thank you very much. So the second group, 32%, practically a third, and large group also, I doubt I carry the gene, but I'm pretty sure I know some people who do. I'm not sure where I'm thinking to this. And then the last group was, I must carry the gene. That explains a lot. That's 17%, 13% say they just don't know. All right, folks, I know you say to people you don't think are all that with it, you say, what are you, a Neanderthal? And now you find out that may be a compliment for all we know.
Yes. And this is reminiscent of the Geico commercials for sure, where people are always picking on the caveman. But I did find it interesting that a majority of Americans, 51%, if you combine people who don't believe it and people who said they just didn't know and were unsure about the answer, so that was the 38% and the 13%. We were denying science a decade and a half ago. So this is not a new thing. Now, certainly this poll sounds like it was done a good deal also for fun by the choices that were given. But I thought that was interesting.
Well, it is factual that we interbred and we have Neanderthal genes in our DNA. They've now discovered. Correct. There's actually much more research since 2012 or 2011 when this poll was done. I just love the phrasing. I don't have it, but I know people who do. I mean, that's one of my favorite questions or answers that I think I've heard on doing this. We're on episode 396. We talk about a lot of polls. That may be my favorite answer provided to respondents in any poll that we've ever done.
Yeah, and I'm surprised so many could resist it.
Mary, I want to hear your take on this because I want more reason in this group than I've been getting so far. So why don't you put some reason into the discussion?
Oh, I don't have reason on this. I mean, I believe it, but I don't want to know if I carry it. I mean, I had to go through genetic testing when I had kids. They didn't ask about this. They didn't test for Neanderthal. I mean, maybe it would have been a good idea if they had.
Do you ever suspect one of the boys has a little Neanderthal?
Don't do that. No, Janet.
Whoa.
Wow.
My mom.
Notice. He didn't mention little Gigi.
I didn't. No, I went directly to, and there were plenty of female Neanderthals, so that was very sexist of me. No, I said that because had my mom been asked this question, she would have said, "Oh yes," about me. So that's why.
Really? Question is not whether we're happy to have Neanderthal genes, but whether Neanderthals would be happy that we took over. That's the question I'm finding.
Oh, I would think not.
Yeah, I think.
Is it possible for us to do a poll that goes back in time? Maybe we could survey the Neanderthals and find out and get back to people on the next episode.
I might not have to go that far back in time, according to this survey.
We don't have to go back in time. We just have to pick the people we're going to poll. Yeah.
Anyway, take care, folks. And if you find any Neanderthals, be kind to your Neanderthals, please. They mean well. They're just misunderstood.
That'll do it for Poll Hut this week. Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Neil Viswanathan, Hunter Petro, and AJ Gambino.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.